The air in the house felt heavy that evening, as though every unsaid word had gathered into a fog that pressed against the walls. The ticking clock on the kitchen wall was the only sound brave enough to exist between them. She sat at the edge of the dining chair, fingers tracing the rim of a cold coffee mug, eyes fixed on the half-empty plate her son had left untouched. He sat across from her, shoulders squared, face hardened by something too mature for his years. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was built from every lie she had told, every truth she had buried beneath the illusion of being a perfect mother. She wanted to speak, to bridge the silence, but her throat tightened whenever she tried. His gaze was distant, but every so often it flicked toward her, as if he was searching for something, an explanation, a confession, maybe even a reason to forgive. The smell of rain drifted through the open window, cold and sharp, mixing with the scent of regret that seemed to cling to her skin. The memory of what she'd done, or rather, what she had allowed, echoed inside her like a haunting. It wasn't lust that broke her family, it was loneliness. It was that quiet, hollow ache that crept in when nights grew too long, when she convinced herself that sacrifice meant hiding her pain instead of sharing it. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the napkin on the table, trying to hide the shaking by folding it, then unfolding it again. He noticed, she could tell by the subtle shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he finally said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the thick air. The words struck her like a blow, not because of their tone, but because of the truth buried inside them. Pretending had been her survival. Pretending to be fine. Pretending that her choices hadn't destroyed everything she loved. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she forced them back. She didn't want his pity. She wanted his understanding, the one thing she knew she didn't deserve. The rain outside began to pour harder, its rhythm beating against the window like an impatient heart. She stared at the storm, remembering how it all began, the small cracks that formed in her marriage, the endless nights of silence, the way she poured her whole heart into being a mother while losing the pieces of herself one by one. When she finally looked back at her son, she saw the same pain mirrored in his eyes. That's when she realized that the betrayal hadn't just broken him, it had reshaped him. He was no longer the boy who used to run to her arms when the thunder scared him. He was a man now, scarred by the truth she never meant for him to see. The sound of the rain had turned into a steady roar, filling the spaces where their words should have been. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles pale against the dim light flickering from the overhead bulb. His breathing grew heavier, the silence between them no longer still but charged, as if both were standing on opposite edges of a truth neither wanted to touch. She could feel his pain before he spoke, it radiated off him in waves, sharp and raw, something almost tangible. When he finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, she saw the reflection of everything she had lost in that gaze, trust, innocence, love. "You said you did it for us," he began, voice trembling despite his effort to sound steady. "But who was us? Because it sure wasn't me." His words came like stones, and with each one, she felt another crack splinter across her chest. She tried to answer, but nothing came out except a quiet gasp that barely sounded human. Her throat felt thick, every word suffocated by the weight of guilt pressing on her lungs. She looked at him, at the face that used to smile so easily, now twisted by resentment and grief. It was like watching a photograph burn, slow, irreversible, agonizing. Her memories came rushing back, not as flashes but as sensations, the coldness of an empty bed, the sound of the front door closing every night, the way she'd learned to smile through loneliness because that was what mothers were supposed to do. She thought she had done what she must to survive, to keep the house standing, to keep her son's world intact. But survival, she now saw, had its own kind of cruelty. It demanded pieces of you, your truth, your peace, sometimes even your soul. And she had given all of that away until there was nothing left to offer but regret. He pushed his chair back suddenly, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor like a scream in the quiet kitchen. "You lied to me," he said, voice breaking this time. "All those years, you lied." His eyes glistened, but no tears fell, he looked like someone who had already cried himself dry long ago. She rose halfway from her chair, instinctively reaching for him, but he flinched back, and the small motion felt like a knife through her heart. She froze where she was, her arms falling uselessly to her sides. There were no words powerful enough to repair what she had shattered. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the room in white for a heartbeat before plunging it back into gray. In that brief moment, she saw him, truly saw him, not as the child she'd raised, but as the man shaped by her mistakes. His pain wasn't just from betrayal, it was from growing up believing in something that never existed. And in his silence, she understood that forgiveness was a distant country neither of them knew how to reach anymore. The next morning came quietly, as if the world itself was exhausted from witnessing their storm. The sunlight slipped through the blinds in narrow, trembling lines, touching the edges of the kitchen table still marked with the ghosts of last night's conversation. She stood by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea that had already gone cold. The house felt different, hollow, rearranged by silence. Every corner seemed to hum with the echo of things said and things left unsaid. She could still feel the weight of his eyes, the bitterness that had settled deep into his tone. It clung to her like a second skin she couldn't shed. She heard the faint creak of the hallway floorboards, and her heart stumbled. He walked in slowly, dressed for work, expression blank and unreadable. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to believe that maybe the distance had softened overnight, that maybe he'd sit down and they'd talk. But he only reached for his keys on the counter, movements mechanical, deliberate. She watched him, memorizing the rhythm of his every action, the way he avoided her gaze, the tightness in his shoulders, the quiet exhale before he turned to leave. "I didn't mean to break you," she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He froze at the door but didn't look back. Her voice cracked, low and trembling. "I thought I was protecting you from the truth. I thought if I carried the pain alone, you could stay whole." Her confession dissolved into the air, fragile and trembling like a candle flame in the wind. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with his back still turned, he spoke, barely above a whisper, but each word landed heavy. "You didn't protect me. You just taught me how to lie." The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound echoed like a final verdict. She sank into the nearest chair, her body folding in on itself, hands clutching at the hem of her robe as if holding herself together by force. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. For a moment, she just stared at the broken pieces, sharp, scattered, glinting under the morning light. It reminded her too much of what her life had become. She wanted to pick them up, to fix it, but her hands stayed still. There was no fixing what had already cut too deep. The day moved on without her. Hours passed, the shadows in the room stretched, then faded again, but she didn't move. Her thoughts drifted through years of laughter, small birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories. Every memory that had once been warm now stung like salt in an open wound. She realized that the greatest punishment wasn't his anger, but the absence of his love. And as the evening crept in again, she whispered his name into the quiet, hoping somehow, the walls that once held their laughter would carry her apology to him.